So we're going to be talking about in this lesson spelling, grammar, and handwriting. We're not going to spend a great deal of time talking about handwriting. We're not going to talk a lot about teaching handwriting, but I want to touch on it in a class on language arts methods. Handwriting is something that often we can gain a lot of information about how to teach from the teacher's manual that comes with a teaching handwriting series that many people use in their classrooms. The Pathways curriculum has handwriting sheets that accompany the each theme book. If you look in the daily lesson guide, the DLG at the back, you can find practice masters for handwriting. Now, with that being said, many teachers feel they need to supplement those practice masters. So let's talk a little bit in general about how we should teach handwriting. We need to remember that a long practice session at the beginning of the day is not nearly as effective as having shorter practice sessions more often. So maybe you can introduce a concept at the beginning of the day and then review it a couple of times throughout the day just for a minute or two. Especially young children, their hands tire very quickly. It's important to remember that handwriting is to be separated from composition. The very quickest way to make our students dislike writing and to be incapable of getting their thoughts down on paper is to insist on perfect handwriting or even cursive handwriting when they write. I believe that when we're doing writer's workshops, students should be able to write in whatever form they feel most comfortable as long as it is legible. Now when they get to publishing, perhaps you can require that they write in cursive or that they do use a certain form, that they have their best handwriting. However, for all of the drafts that happen in process handwriting, we definitely should not be focusing, for all of the drafts that happen in writer's workshop, we should not be burdening students with worrying about their handwriting. So whenever we think about the components of what we teach in handwriting, the first thing we want to teach our students is the correct letter formation. How do they form the letter correctly? Next, we want them to be working on uniform letter size. And then we want them to be able to focus on having a uniform slant to their handwriting. So we go in that order and we do those things one at a time. Now, it's best to work on several, but not all letters at a time. And you can add more letters to practice as the ones you begin with are mastered. You need to be sure that when students are practicing, you are watching what they're doing. Handwriting is not something that we can do, especially with younger children, in isolation, because practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And if our students fill up a page with an incorrect formation of a letter, or a lack of uniform size or slant, that practice is teaching them to do things incorrectly. So we should be overseeing them when they are practicing. Large tools such as large pencils are often best for younger children, and we also should begin with lines and shapes. When we're teaching our students how to form lines, we want them to know that they always form their lines from left to right and from top to bottom. And we teach them when they're doing a circle, start at 2 o'clock and circle around. These are some of the basic handwriting guidelines when we're teaching handwriting. So language arts methods can seem very overwhelming as we think about all the various things that we must teach. But we must remember that literacy is like a braid, and that all the things that we work on in the language arts workshop are strands of a braid. We all know what the Bible says about how if we are joined together, a rope that has many strands is not easily broken. It's the same thing with literacy. If we can help our students in all areas to grow and recognize that the areas where they're strong can help them to be stronger in other areas, we can be accomplishing helping them accomplish their goals in the language arts workshop. So oral language leads to storytelling and reading and writing, and then a final part of that braid of literacy is orthography. Now, what is orthography? Well, let's also talk about what is word study. Word study is basically when we provide instruction to our students in phonics, spelling, and vocabulary. Orthography is when we are helping our students learn, when we're teaching orthography, we're helping them learn the correct sequences of letters in the writing system. Word study is very important because to be fully literate, not only must you be able to recognize words in text in a fast and accurate way as you make meaning as you read, but you also must be able to produce words in a fast and accurate way as you write. So studying words is important, very important. Now, in many classrooms, spelling is approached in a way that is not as effective as we could be. I know that for many years when I taught spelling, I simply would take whatever grade level consumable textbook I was using in my class, and the students would complete activities all week long in that textbook, and then I would give them a test on Friday. Now, I knew that my students, I knew that some of them could spell every single word correctly on Friday and on Monday, and that they had grown none from what I had taught them. I knew that other students could work and they might not be able to spell all of the words, but by Friday they would get a 100 on their test. Then I knew there were other students who might work so hard all week long, their parents might work with them 30, 45 minutes every day on those spelling words, and they still might not be able to spell those words at the end of the week. Further, many of the students in each group might not be able to spell those words correctly when they were writing. So I knew something was wrong with this approach, but spelling was one of those go-to things that I didn't have to worry too much about. It was there, the students knew what to expect, I knew what to expect, their parents knew what to expect, and it's kind of hard to rock that boat. People can resist you choosing to do things differently. However, when I was getting my master's degree, I learned that spelling is, just like other processes in the language arts, developmental, and students go through stages of development that have nothing to do with what grade level they are in. We can make generalizations about typically where students are in the stages of spelling based on their grade level, but just like reading, we may have a 5th grader at a lower stage, and we may have a 2nd grader at a higher stage, because students develop differently. Some are at the emergent stage longer, some are at the letter name alphabetic, some are at the within word pattern stage, some are at the syllables and affixes stage longer, and some very quickly get to the final stage where you're writing traditional spelling very easily, and that's the derivational relation stage. Now, these stages are something that researchers who created a program called Words Their Way came up with to describe the words of the stages of spelling. Other researchers call them different things, but the important thing for us to recognize is that our students are at various developmental levels, and all people, when they're learning to spell, do progress through similar stages. So it's not that important what we call them, but it's important to recognize the developmental nature of spelling. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this program, the Words Their Way program. It's not something that is very easily picked up from a brief lecture in a language arts methods class. However, I do know many people who have learned to do it by purchasing a book about it and just reading that book. Additionally, if you search online, you can find various online courses on how to teach spelling in this way, and I've seen several that are $200 or less. If you could find funding for that, that would be an excellent way for you to learn how to be a better language arts methods teacher, especially in the area of spelling. So we're going to go through and look at the various stages of spelling and what they look like typically. Each of the stages have 3 levels, an early, middle, and late stage. So if you take that and you think of the 5 stages, there are about 15 places we can think about where our students might be. A child who is an emergent speller are definitely not writing or reading conventionally. This could range from just making random marks to making letters that have no relationship to sound. Students in this stage are pre-phonetic, which means that if they do write a letter, it has nothing to do with the sound of the word they may be trying to make. And children at this stage are usually between birth and 5 years of age. However, at the very late stages, they may be getting close to writing a single letter to represent a word, and that letter may have something to do with the sound of the most salient, easily heard sound in the word. So you may think to yourself, how could I think about if I recognize I have a student at this stage, how might I teach them? Well, at each stage, if you look at what the children are trying to do and you think about that, that can guide what you teach them and how they teach them. In grades K through 2, if you're using a good phonics program, if you have tested your students and you're teaching them at the right spot within the phonics program, very often you will also be teaching them what they need to learn in spelling as well. But if you're thinking about the emergent stage of spelling, basically at this stage it's a super important stage for us to think about as teachers. We're helping our very youngest learners understand that letters have names and they have sounds, and there's a difference between the two. We're teaching them to learn that consonants happen in our mouths the way that our mouths work. It's in a very particular way, and they're beginning to spell words with just the consonants, like we said a while ago. And they're learning that short vowels can cause problems because they can't feel those in their mouth, so they leave them out. So that's one of the things we can teach them, is how to not leave out the vowels, how every word needs to have a vowel. So we can do that. We can teach them very well at this stage with picture sorts, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. The picture sorts are something that we can also do at every stage. Basically, we're teaching our students to think about sounds rather than conventional spelling when we're using picture sorts. Now the next stage is the letter name alphabetic stage. Letter name alphabetic stage is a time when students are getting a little bit more refined in their knowledge of orthography. This is the time usually when students are being formally taught to read, grades kindergarten and first. This is where students are learning to use the names of letters in combination with the alphabetic principle. So if you look at the 3 levels, early, middle, and late, at the early letter name alphabetic stage, students might write a B or a BD for bed. When they're in the middle of that stage, they might be confusing vowels. They're starting to understand we need to use vowels, but they don't know which vowel to use, so they might put BAD for bed. When they're trying to spell ship, they might put the S, they may put SEP or something like that. If they are spelling the word R, this looks a little bit more like texting lingo, doesn't it? Maybe some of our students are reverting, or even us, some of us are reverting when we text and using letter name alphabetic spellings. But basically you can see that as they progress through this stage, they are getting more and more sophisticated in their attempts at conventional spelling, but they're definitely still having a really hard time with the vowels. Now, within word pattern spelling stage, it's when students are beginning to have a sight word vocabulary when they're reading of around 200 to 400 words. They're usually between ages of 7 to 10, and they're beginning to transition to independent reading. So their spelling would look more like this. They're trying to understand when they're using words that a vowel or two vowels might be required to form the words that they're trying to say, to spell. Now the fourth stage, syllables and affixes spelling, is usually intermediate grades, maybe upper elementary, middle school years, between 9 and 14. Students in this stage are beginning to try to spell multisyllabic words and trying to understand patterns. You can see that at the early stages, that when they add a suffix like ing, they may not know yet to add to double the p. When they spell cattle or other words that have the le, they may switch around the e and the l. They're not perfect at understanding how to use vowels to be more predictable. Now, as they progress, they are getting much better at using their vowels, but they may still be having trouble, especially with that schwa sound, the sound. They don't know how to spell those words conventionally yet. The fifth stage of spelling, derivational relations, is where we are as adults, hopefully, and some middle school students, high school students, college students are also there. Students spell most words correctly at this stage, and their knowledge builds and expands on their vocabulary knowledge, and they begin to examine how words are derived and how roots and bases work. They're learning, when they're at this stage, spelling really becomes more of a vocabulary sort of activity. It's still spelling, they're learning conventional spelling, but they're also thinking about word parts and what those word parts mean. Now, some of you may be thinking, how would I know where my students are at what stage they're at? One of the best things you can do is simply think about the stages, look at some of the examples I've given you, and look at what students are learning at that stage, and then look at a sample of their writing. Now, if you would like to explore this a little bit more, there are things called spelling inventories, which you can Google and find online very easily. It's basically where you analyze how students spell words and the patterns in words, and it's just like a traditional spelling test when you give it to the students, but it's what you do afterwards that turns it into a spelling inventory, where you're looking at how they used their various knowledge to spell words. So a spelling inventory is like a spelling test, but you analyze the results closely. You can find them online. You can also find online, it recommends which ones to use. Usually the ones called primary ones are for K through 3, but if you have a very advanced speller in those grades, you may need to use an intermediate one. There are also upper grade ones that you can find online. You administer them by calling out the words, and you ask the students to please try to spell all the words, to do their very best. You tell them, I know that some of these words may be something you have no idea how to spell, but I want you to try to have a letter for every sound you hear and do your best job. So when you look at this slide, you can see an example of a primary spelling inventory. Basically, to administer this spelling inventory, you would simply say, number 1, fan. I could use a fan on a hot day. Fan. Number 2, pet, and so on, just like you would a normal spelling test. It's what comes afterwards, the analysis and scoring, that is what turns this into a spelling inventory rather than a spelling test. So you can see here an example of Words Their Way primary spelling inventory feature guide. this is what you would use to score and figure out where your students are in the stages of spelling. So I will not be teaching you in this class all the various ways that things that you have to do to conduct an analysis and scoring of a primary or any spelling inventory, but I'm going to very briefly mention to you just some key elements of doing so. Whenever you have administered the test to the students and you're ready to score, first what you would do is come to this column, words spelled correctly, right here. And you quickly go down the list of words and put a check mark for every word that is spelled correctly, and you count the number of check marks, and that becomes your score here at the bottom. Now, if you are then going to be doing the rest of the analysis, you would say the child spelled fan correctly. We would give a check mark here in this column. And if they spelled the word correctly, they got all of the word features right. So I know I can go ahead and I can circle each of these features. Kind of looks like I'm marking them out, but I'm trying to circle them. And so they got 3 feature points for the word fan and 1 point for spelling it correctly. They got the beginning consonant correct, the final consonant, and the short vowel. Now, if they did the word pet correctly, we would put the check mark, we would circle every letter. Now, say if we asked them to spell dig and they spelled it D-E-G, they would not get a check mark in the word spelled correctly, but they would get the D and the G circled. They'd get those feature points because they did get the beginning consonant and the final consonant right. Now, when you're all done and you're done with the scoring, and if any of you have more questions about this because you're planning on conducting inventories with your students, I'll be happy to answer more questions for you about the total process. But I will tell you that when you're all done grading and you total the feature points for each category, down here at the bottom, you're looking where it says cells with 2 or more errors. So we would total, say the first column, they got all of the beginning consonants that we examined. We don't examine the beginning consonants for every single word, but we do for some. Say they got all but that one correct that we just spoke about. We would write a 6 here, and we would think to ourselves, I'm not too worried about their beginning consonants because they have 6 out of 7. They didn't miss 2 or more. And then say for their final consonants, they got all of them correct. We would give them a 7, and we're definitely not worried here. Now say on their short vowels, they got 5 correct and they missed 2. This is the first place where we might think to ourselves, this is where I need to be teaching my students, this student. Now, if this particular student is in first grade, there's no need to worry because that's about the spot that we would expect a first grader to possibly be in. We know we need to work on short vowels with them, how to spell short vowels. If this is what you see when you have a 5th grader, you know you have a lot of remediation to do and you need to be spending a great deal of time working with that student. It wouldn't make much sense to put a 5th grader who is missing short vowels on a spelling inventory. It wouldn't make much sense to put them on that 5th grade list that comes in the spelling curriculum, would it? So this is where you may not want to use the Words Their Way program, but maybe you want to use an inventory to test your students just to help you as a teacher think about where you want to begin teaching those students and what would be best for the students. I actually had spelling groups just as I did reading groups and math groups in my classroom, and students who were near each other in level worked on the same concepts and list of words as those who were the same as them. However, if I had a student who was at a different level, it didn't make sense to me having them work on the same set of words. And that's why I chose to differentiate, because I know that spelling is developmental. So if you are not going to use the consumable student curriculum or the curriculum that's in the Pathways materials, then what might you use? To plan my word study block, I always try to incorporate sorts, word hunts, games, and activities that could not only help my students learn, but could up their engagement in the process. Now, I want to spend the most time talking about sorting because this may be what some of you are most unfamiliar with. There are three main types of word sorts. We can have picture sorts, which are usually used at the early stages of spelling. We can have word sorts, where they're thinking about the sound versus the spelling. And then we can have blind sorts, where they're sorting by the way a word sounds without visual clues. We use keywords or headings when we're sorting, and that's important when you're doing a visual pattern sort or a picture sort. We also can have concept sorts. This is great when we're thinking of content area vocabulary, themed words, and we can also have spelling and meaning sorts. If you look in the very middle of the slide, you can see a short A word sort. This is where we're looking for word families, and we're having the students sort whether words end with at, an, ap, or ac. And we could turn this into a blind sort by saying a word out loud without showing it to the student, and then having them point to the words that it should go with. We could then hand them the paper with that word on it and let them place it on the sort. Over on the far right of the slide, you can see a more advanced sort that would be at the derivational relation stage, where students can sort words and think about their meanings based on what they know about where the headings, the prefixes, are derived from. So if they think about micro, mega, hyper, and super, if they sort the words by those and then compare the meanings of the words, then you can let them discover what, by analysis, what each of those prefixes mean, which enhances their vocabulary knowledge. You can see in the bottom right of this slide a picture sort, which is based on the digraphs the, ch, sh, and w. And here students are thinking about the sound that the digraphs make and sorting the words based on the pictures. Now, sometimes people go back, teachers do, and they write the actual words on the pictures and help the students then have a visual of the word as well. So anyway, this is what sorting looks like. If you're interested in sorting and doing this with your students, you can do this using the Pathways curriculum because many of those lists are based on patterns. You could also look into purchasing the Words Their Way book, and the Words Their Way also has several companion books. That is a book full of sorts just for each stage of spelling. So they have a book of sorts for emergent spellers. They have another book of sorts for within word pattern spellers. They have another for syllables and affixes spellers, and another for derivational relation spellers. And then I forgot to say they have one for the letter name alphabetic spellers. So that would be a great resource for you, whether you're planning to do the whole program or not. You could use those sorts to supplement what you are doing within your program. So earlier I mentioned that while spelling is developmental, we can expect our students who are on grade level in spelling to be around certain stages. So you can see from this chart about where students in different grade levels would be. So we're also going to talk very briefly about teaching grammar. I want to talk first of all about what does not work. Whenever I taught, probably the first at least half of my teaching career, I used the same approach, despite my realization that it was pretty ineffective. I would spend my first 6 weeks of every single school year teaching, reteaching the parts of speech and the types of sentences and what phrases and clauses and punctuation are. I would also, for the rest of the year, go through sequential exercises in my English book. Sometimes my students would do 30, 40 or more of various exercises, and then I would be so surprised that it never seemed to carry over this work they were doing into their writing. The reason I've learned since that this approach does not work is that there is no transfer, studies have shown, from grammar concepts that are learned in isolation to their writing. And that is because it bears no relevance to students' daily lives or their future lives. And often it's because we're working at the very lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy, and they might remember it for a short period of time, but they don't truly understand the concepts because they have not applied them. Now, when we think about grammar, let's think about what does work. And when I say work, I mean what affects students' writing and makes it better. There are not very many jobs where someone has to conjugate sentences or find the noun or the complete subject or anything such as that. But many jobs require that we be able to write and write well. Not only that, we need writing for many other purposes besides just what we might need writing for at work. So let's think about grammar and what works, because we want to help students have better writing, not because we want them to have better grammar. We do want them to speak with correct grammar and write with correct grammar. However, grammar is a means to an end, not the end itself. So first of all, we always teach grammar in the context of students' writing. We don't separate it out from our writer's workshop. We conduct many lessons within our writer's workshop. For example, you may say to your students, today we're going to be learning about how to have our subjects and verbs match. And you could go through a sample of writing and help them understand perhaps that the person who has written has a singular subject and a plural verb, and why this is incorrect and how they can recognize that and correct it. And then you say to them, I'd like you to be very careful in your writing today and check and see if you could find an example of this grammar concept, either where you used it incorrectly and then you corrected it, or where you used it correctly to begin with. And we'll talk about those again later. And then you revisit it when you come back for share time, when students want to share their examples. Now, you also need to, if you're teaching this way, which is the correct way to teach, you need to know your standards for language arts very well. What should they be able to do? What should they know in the area of grammar and of writing? You need to know your students, and the best way to know them is to listen to them talk and to look at their writing that they do without anyone helping them, not writing that they take home that possibly a mom or an older brother or sister could help with, but writing that they do on demand without the benefit of editing tools. That can let you know what they need to be taught. Now, you also need to help students value good and beautiful writing and show them how grammar can help them write better. Very few people get excited about doing something like writing in a grammatically correct way by being told what they're doing wrong. So try to keep your focus positive, make it fun. Use things such as games and Mad Libs and songs. You can check out Schoolhouse Rock videos on YouTube, which this website has quite a few examples of grammar songs. Just look for any and every way that you can to make teaching grammar something that is effective and learning grammar something that is fun.